My sister passed away and left me 250 acres of vineyard, 400 cattle, and a classic Cadillac. My daughter, who cut me off 8 years ago, suddenly showed up in heels and said, "I'm here to help manage it all." But when my lawyer and 2 deputies walked in, she stepped back 3 times. You know, there are some moments in life that just absolutely shatter you. But then, there are those rare, earth-shattering moments where someone tries to obliterate you in front of everyone you know, with words sharp as knives, and that's when you discover the steel in your own spine. For me, that moment arrived at my sister's funeral. Can you even imagine? We were all gathered there, 100 grieving souls, saying goodbye to Lydia, my amazing sister. And then, my own daughter, Vanessa, stood up, her voice slicing through the hushed sorrow like a siren. She called me a parasite. In front of everyone. She shrieked that I had no right to Lydia's 250-acre vineyard, to the 400 head of cattle, the vintage Cadillac, or the staggering $1.8 million Lydia had left solely to me. 8 years. 8 years ago, Vanessa had cut me out of her life because I refused to bankroll her husband's failing business scheme. That day, she'd turned her back on me. But this time, at my sister's funeral, with all those witnesses, she tried to erase me completely. I stood there, utterly frozen in a raw, searing shame. But deep inside, beneath the shock, something hard and unyielding began to rise. What came next would make her regret every single moment she ever underestimated me. I didn't utter a single word when she called me a parasite. Not when her voice grew so loud it bounced off the church ceiling, making the stained glass windows seem to vibrate. Not when a woman in the front row gasped, a sound so sharp it felt like a physical blow. Not even when I saw Samuel, Lydia's loyal vineyard manager, lower his head in quiet disbelief. I just stood there. Lydia's casket was still at the altar, surrounded by the sweet, heavy scent of lilies and a photograph of her in her garden hat, laughing, just like she used to when we were kids, before everything got so complicated. Lydia Monroe, owner of a sprawling vineyard, hundreds of cattle, a classic car, and a fortune in personal accounts. And she had left every single bit of it to me. But none of that seemed to matter to Vanessa, my daughter, who hadn't spoken to me in 8 long years. She'd cut me off, vanished, because I refused to give her husband $30,000 for a business venture that, even on paper, screamed failure in 6 months. When I said no, she'd spat that I had failed her as a mother. Then she was gone. And now, in front of 100 mourners, Lydia's friends, the vineyard workers, even reporters like that young woman, Clara, with her discreet camera tucked under her jacket, Vanessa was performing a public execution. "This woman is not entitled to anything," she raged. "She doesn't deserve the land. She never helped Aunt Lydia. She doesn't know the first thing about wine or cattle." She didn't stop. Her words kept coming, relentless, like a volley of fists, knocking the breath clean out of me. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I didn't ask her to stop. But what I did feel, somewhere beneath the shame and the heat crawling up my neck, was something hard. A kind of weight, pressing into my ribs like armor. It had been growing for years, ever since Richard, her father, had used every manipulative trick he knew to make her believe I was the enemy. And now here it was, fully formed, standing strong inside me while Vanessa tried to tear me down, piece by painful piece, in public. After her outburst, the room fell into a heavy, waiting silence. The priest, bless his heart, looked utterly lost. People avoided my eyes, their gazes darting to the floor or the ceiling. A few offered weak, almost apologetic smiles, but most just looked away. Then Samuel, quiet and sturdy as the ancient oak trees in Lydia's vineyard, stepped beside me. He placed a hand gently on my elbow and whispered, "Let's sit." But I shook my head, my jaw tight. I needed to feel the sting. Let her finish, I thought. Let her bleed out every last drop of venom. Let everyone hear it. Because the moment she stopped screaming, I knew the silence that followed would belong to me. When the service finally ended, I stayed behind. I watched the last of the crowd drift out into the warm Soma afternoon. Vanessa didn't even glance back at me. She just left with her lawyer, not a single tear, not a backward look at Lydia's casket. I walked up to Lydia's photograph and straightened the frame. Her eyes were crinkled in that way they always were when she caught me eating grapes straight off the vine, just like we used to do as kids. "I heard you, Lydia," I whispered, the words a promise. "I know what you wanted, and I won't let her touch it." Out in the gravel lot, reporters hovered, unsure whether to approach. I kept walking. Clara, the one with the camera, gave me a small, knowing nod. That was all. Just a nod. But something in her face told me the world had seen what happened in that church, and they would remember. Later that evening, I sat at the kitchen table in the old cottage behind the vineyard house. It was the same table where Lydia and I, at 8 and 10, used to eat toast, waiting for the sun to come up so we could run through the vines barefoot. Now, it was covered in intimidating legal folders. Maxwell Thornton, Lydia's attorney, arrived right at 7. He was a calm man, almost cold in his professionalism. "Harriet," he said as he opened his briefcase, "I'm here to begin the formal reading of your sister's will. As per her wishes, this process will be conducted privately, in your presence only. No theatrics, no drama," he stated, and then he read the final line. "All land, assets, livestock, personal property, and cash holdings are hereby transferred in full to my sister, Harriet Monroe. I entrust her to preserve this land, as I know she carries its roots in her bones." My breath caught in my throat. Maxwell handed me a sealed envelope. Lydia's handwriting. I recognized the familiar slant instantly. "I'll read it later," I told him, my voice a little shaky. He nodded. "We have a lot to review in the coming days. But know this, your sister made everything legally airtight. She anticipated resistance." I let out a dry, hollow laugh. "I already felt the first wave crash this morning," I murmured. Maxwell paused, his eyes sharp, before standing. "That was not the last," he warned. He left the folder on the table, tipped his hat, and disappeared into the night. I stared down at the papers. It didn't feel like victory. Not yet. But the shaking had stopped, and that, I knew, meant something. The next morning started with dust and silence, a familiar comfort. I was already up when Samuel arrived, just past 6. He brought black coffee in a thermos and 2 croissants from the bakery down by the square. We didn't speak much, just sat on the back porch, watching the fog roll off the lower fields like steam off a kettle. "Lydia's land. My land now." Samuel broke the silence first. "She meant every word in that will, Harriet. I hope you know that." I nodded once, a silent acknowledgement. The quiet between us wasn't uncomfortable. It never had been. He sipped his coffee, then spent the rest of the morning at Lydia's old desk, sorting through the folders Maxwell had left behind. Titles, deeds, insurance policies, names of ranch hands, vendor lists. There was a clarity to the paperwork, a strong, undeniable structure. Nothing like the chaos Vanessa had thrown into that church the day before. By noon, I was sitting at the long table in the vineyard office with Maxwell and Lydia's accountant. "The transfer is complete," Maxwell confirmed. "As of this morning, all holdings are in your name." I signed the final page and closed the folder, a sense of gravity settling over me. He looked at me over the rim of his glasses. "I assume your daughter has not reached out." "Not a word," I replied, the bitterness barely perceptible. He gave a tight nod. "Then you should be prepared for the next stage. She won't go quietly." I leaned back in the chair, a new resolve hardening my expression. "I don't expect her to." She did not disappoint. That evening, a courier arrived at the front gate with a packet of legal documents. I opened them alone in the quiet kitchen, standing by the sink. Demand for immediate reconsideration of will execution. Petition to delay asset transfer. Motion to freeze estate distribution pending formal challenge. All of it signed by her attorney. All of it aggressive. Vanessa never was subtle. I picked up the phone and called Maxwell. "She's trying to freeze everything," I told him, my voice steady. He didn't hesitate. "I'll file the response before midnight." "She has no standing." "She wasn't in the original will. No history of support or contribution. Just noise." Still, it lit something in me. A fire, past the old irrigation shed and down the dirt path Lydia and I used to walk every spring. Back then, we would dream about what the land could become. Back when I thought Vanessa might be part of it one day. That dream was long gone now. The vineyard was mine, and with it came the burden, the fierce necessity, of defending what Lydia had trusted me to carry. The very next day, Vanessa arrived in person. No call ahead. No knock on the door. I saw her through the kitchen window, standing at the front steps in black slacks and a wine-colored blazer. Her hair was tied back tight. Her expression was even tighter. I opened the door and said nothing. She stepped inside like she owned the very air, her gaze sweeping around the familiar, comfortable room with mock disappointment. "Still the same curtains," she sniffed. "Still smells like wet books and regret." I closed the door behind her, the sound echoing ominously. She turned to me, her eyes challenging. "You think this is over? You think a signature and a letter from a dead woman can erase everything I've done for this family?" I crossed my arms, my stance firm. 8 years, Vanessa. You've been gone 8 years. You never called. Not once. She smiled, slow and bitter. "You think I needed to call? I was out building something real." I let the silence settle, heavy and pregnant with unsaid accusations. She began to pace the room, as if presenting to a jury. "My husband and I built something from nothing. We just needed one push. You turned your back on us." I still said nothing. "So now," she continued, her voice gaining a dangerous edge, "you're going to fix that. You're going to sign over half the land. Not all. Just half. That's fair. And the cattle. I know a guy who can take the herd off your hands for a good price. You wouldn't even have to lift a finger." I didn't move. She pulled papers from her briefcase, pushing them towards me. My voice was calm, almost unnervingly so. No. She blinked, as if she hadn't heard me correctly. Excuse me? No, I repeated, firmer this time. Her jaw locked. I gave you a chance to do this the easy way. I stepped forward, my gaze unwavering. You gave me nothing. You walked away. You erased me. And now you're standing in my sister's house, asking me to give you what she left behind. I watched her face shift. Not to hurt, not to understanding, but to cold, calculated anger. She adjusted her tone, softened it, a predatory calm. Mom, let's not fight. We can work together. You don't have the background to run this place. I can help. I took the papers from her hand, walked to the fireplace, and dropped them in. She stared at the flames as they caught, a silent testament to my resolve. Then she turned and walked out the door. No threats, no yelling. But I knew it wasn't over. That woman wasn't my daughter anymore. She was a storm coming, and I was done seeking shelter. 2 days passed before the next move came. I spent those days walking the vineyard with Samuel, reviewing harvest schedules and distribution contracts. There was comfort in the rhythm of it, the hum of bees, the steady pace of boots on soil, the smell of ripe fruit in the August sun. The land was honest, even if the people around it were not. Samuel didn't ask about Vanessa. He didn't have to. We both knew something was brewing, a tempest gathering force. On the third morning, Eleanor Price showed up at my door with a paper bag of peaches and a frown already settling on her face. Eleanor, a sharp, direct, and fiercely loyal woman. We'd met in college, reconnected years later when she returned to Soma after retiring from the bench. She didn't bother with small talk. She set the bag on the table and pulled out her phone. You need to see this, she stated, her voice clipped. She showed me a screenshot, a blog post. My name was in the headline, Local Retiree Inherits Vineyard, Freezes Out Real Heir. My name, Lydia's, Vanessa's, of course. A grainy photo of me outside the courthouse, head down, sunglasses on, the kind of image people use when they want to suggest guilt without evidence. It was slick, a perfectly crafted mix of half-truths and insidious insinuations. It painted me as greedy, manipulative. It claimed I had exploited a dying sister, taken advantage of Lydia's grief after her husband died, and convinced her to change her will. None of it true. All of it intentional. I didn't speak for a while. I read the whole thing, top to bottom, twice. Then I set the phone down, a cold rage simmering beneath my skin. She wants a war, I said, my voice dangerously low. Eleanor nodded slowly. And she wants to win it in the court of public opinion before the law catches up. Later that afternoon, I found Samuel in the equipment shed, replacing a valve on one of the pressure tanks. I handed him the phone. He read the article without saying a word. When he was done, he handed it back, his eyes meeting mine. She's going for your throat, he observed grimly. Let her, I replied, the words surprising even myself with their force. His eyes held mine, searching. You sure? I was. Because I could see it now. Clear as glass. Vanessa wasn't here for family or memory or even control. She was here for liquidation. She wanted to chop Lydia's life into parcels and sell it to the highest bidder. She wanted the money in her account, the cattle on a truck, the vines under contract to some private equity firm that would replace the rich soil with synthetic drip lines and squeeze every last drop out of the land until it broke. She didn't care about what was built. She cared only about what could be sold. That night, Maxwell came by to drop off the final trust statements. He also brought a copy of the same blog post, printed and highlighted. This came from her husband's marketing firm, he said, without emotion. I traced the domain. Of course it did. She hadn't just decided to attack. She had prepared for it. Maxwell tapped his folder. Her attorney has filed another motion. This one requesting an emergency hearing to challenge the will. He looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. I'll handle it, but I want you to be ready. I am, I asserted, a quiet certainty settling over me. The next morning, Vanessa returned. No warning, no knocking. I heard her voice before I saw her, raised, controlled, clearly performing. I stepped out onto the front porch just in time to hear her talking to one of the ranch hands. I'm sure you're all wondering how long you'll have jobs once my mother cashes out. The man she was speaking to, Jordan, barely 20, looked like he wanted to vanish into the dirt. Vanessa spotted me, her smile spreading wide, her eyes cold. Just making sure everyone knows what's coming, she said, climbing the steps without invitation. I blocked the doorway. You've said enough. She tilted her head, feigning innocence. The community deserves the truth. You don't care about this community, I retorted, my voice unwavering. You don't even live here. She stepped back and gestured toward the vines. And yet I was born on this land. You raised me here. That should mean something. It did. Once. She studied me, saw the steel under the quiet. Then she dropped the next blow. I've met with investors. 2 serious offers on the table already. We can both walk away from this with what we want. I said nothing. She leaned in, her voice a seductive whisper. You keep the house and a little land. I take the rest. It's a win-win. You don't want the headache of running this place. I kept my voice steady, my gaze locked on hers. You think money is the goal? I asked, a profound sadness mixing with my anger. It never was. She scoffed, a brittle sound. Then what is this? Pride? Spite? No, I stated, clear and firm. Legacy. She turned and walked away. Not defeated, just retreating, regrouping. That afternoon, Maxwell called again. Her legal team had submitted documents questioning my mental fitness, claimed I was under emotional duress, argued that I was too old, too detached from the land, too erratic to be trusted with the estate. They attached statements, none from people who actually knew me, just thin affidavits from paid experts and distant cousins I hadn't spoken to in 20 years. Still, the intent was clear. Vanessa wasn't trying to win in court. She was trying to overwhelm, smear, drown me in papers and headlines and public whispers. She thought I'd fold. She didn't know me at all. I spent the evening rereading Lydia's letter. The ink was dark, the handwriting steady. Lydia had always been exacting. Her words were measured, deliberate. She wrote that I had always known how to wait, how to endure, that I understood the value of patience, of timing, of precision. That was the profound difference between Vanessa and me. Vanessa shouted. I listened. Vanessa grabbed. I watched. She stormed. I endured. But not forever. I folded the letter, set it in the drawer, and turned off the light. The next phase wouldn't be about defense. It would be about exposure. Let her keep talking. I had something else. Truth and proof and a plan. I met Eleanor at the old cafe across from the courthouse. She chose the corner table, her back to the window, eyes on the door. Years of being a judge had made her alert in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. She wore no makeup, her silver hair pulled into a neat knot. Her hands were steady as she poured sugar into her tea. She didn't ask how I was doing. She just waited. I laid the folder on the table. It was light, thin, but it felt like granite between my hands. She opened it. Photos, emails, a transcript of a phone call. Samuel had helped gather it all with quiet precision. He still had connections from the years he spent as vineyard manager under Lydia. Vanessa had underestimated how many people were still fiercely loyal to this land. Eleanor scanned the documents in silence. She placed a finger on one of the emails, tapping it once. This is enough to ruin her in court, she stated, not as a threat, just a fact. Vanessa had been working with a commercial developer based in Nevada. They had been in talks to parcel the vineyard into private estates and winery resorts. The emails revealed her intention to dissolve the foundation Lydia had set up, to remove the farm hands, bulldoze the cottages. None of this had been discussed with me. It wasn't just disrespect. It was premeditated, a calculated act of destruction. Eleanor closed the folder. Her voice was low and even. You said you didn't want to fight her through the courts. I don't, I confirmed. Then use the court of truth, she advised. I nodded. Later that day, I met with Clara Whitmore, the local journalist who had filmed the incident at the funeral. She hadn't run the footage yet. She said she was waiting for the right moment. I told her it was time. I handed her the folder. Her eyes widened as she flipped through the contents. She asked for a quiet room and a few hours. I gave her both. By sunset, she had assembled a devastating report. She showed me the first cut. No music, no fancy edits, just truth layered with more truth. Vanessa yelling at the funeral. The footage zooming in on faces turning away, then documents, voiceovers, screenshots of the emails lined up with dates and names. A clear, irrefutable path from her arrival to her malicious intentions to sell. It was clean, harsh, honest. I asked her to hold it for one more day. I had my own work to do. That night, I unlocked the small safe Lydia kept in her office. The combination was the same one she used for everything: birth year, graduation year, wedding date. Inside was a stack of letters and a small digital recorder. I charged the device and played the most recent file. Lydia's voice filled the room, slow and careful, as if she was afraid of running out of time. She talked about Vanessa, about her charm, her manipulation, how she had once believed Vanessa would carry the family's legacy, until she learned otherwise. Lydia spoke of betrayal, of disappointment, of how Vanessa had pressured her to change the will, how she had cried when Lydia refused, and how Vanessa in response had disappeared for 3 years. She closed the message with a sentence that pierced my chest, a profound validation. I'm leaving it all to you, not because you want it, but because you won't sell it. I saved the recording and made 3 backup copies. The truth, I knew, was my greatest weapon. The next morning, I invited Maya to walk the fields with me. She had been quiet the past few days, keeping her distance. I didn't blame her. This wasn't her fight. She had come here to learn about winemaking, not get caught in a family war. We walked the rows in silence, the grapes nearly ready, full, firm, sweet. Finally, she said, I saw the blog post. I didn't believe a word of it. I thanked her, a knot in my stomach loosening slightly. I told her about Lydia's message, about the video Clara had built, about the town hall meeting happening in 2 days. Her eyes lit with something like hope. You're going to show it? Yes, I affirmed. The hall was already reserved. Lydia had booked it months before for the annual Vineyard Appreciation Night. Vanessa thought it was cancelled, but I kept the reservation. Now, it would be used for something else entirely. The next 48 hours moved fast, a blur of purposeful action. Clara polished the final report. Maxwell reviewed it for liability. Samuel called in 3 former managers who had worked under Vanessa's husband and had been burned when his business folded. Eleanor prepared a written statement in case the meeting got out of hand. I didn't sleep, not because of fear, but because of clarity. I finally understood what Lydia had known. That silence protects no one. That dignity without action is just surrender, dressed up to look noble. The night of the meeting, I arrived early. I wore dark jeans, a clean white shirt, and Lydia's vineyard hat, a silent tribute. People filled the seats quickly, workers, neighbors, former staff. A few reporters, even the mayor showed up, sensing the weight of the moment. Vanessa walked in 20 minutes late, her heels loud against the floor, a theatrical entrance. She took a seat in the front, crossed her legs, and smirked. She thought this was another attempt at public sympathy, another chance for her to dominate the narrative. She didn't know the screen behind her would soon show her own damning emails. The lights dimmed. Clara stood and introduced the report. She didn't embellish, just stated the facts, her voice steady and clear. The video began. You could have heard a pin drop. No one moved. The footage of Vanessa screaming at Lydia's funeral, followed by the cold, calculating emails about bulldozing and selling, hit them like a physical blow. When it ended, the room sat in stunned silence, then murmurs, then voices rising, a ripple of outrage. Samuel stood and spoke, his voice filled with quiet passion for the land. Then Eleanor, sharp and articulate. Then a field worker who had been with the vineyard for 21 years, his weathered face etched with pain and loyalty. They spoke of integrity, of trust, of what Lydia had built, and what Vanessa had sought to destroy. Vanessa stood, red-faced, her usual poise shattered. She tried to shout over the rising noise, but no one was listening anymore. I walked to the microphone, my heart thrumming. I looked out over the room, seeing the faces of people who had given their lives to this land. Then I looked at her, my daughter, my adversary. You came here for money, I stated, my voice calm but resounding. I came back for memory. She opened her mouth, but there was nothing left to say. The meeting ended with a vote, a symbolic one, but profoundly powerful, support for Harriet Monroe as sole steward of Lydia's estate. Every single hand went up, even the mayor's. Vanessa walked out alone, and this time, no one followed. The fallout began before the chairs were even folded. By the time I returned home from the town hall meeting, Clara's report had already been clipped into short segments and shared across every corner of Sonoma County. The clip of Vanessa's voice screaming at the funeral. The email showing her agreement to bulldoze the barn. The spreadsheet with a breakdown of projected profits from luxury resort parcels. It was all over social media. I didn't post a word myself. I didn't have to. The town did it for me. At sunrise, Samuel texted me 2 words. It started. By noon, the wine co-op pulled Vanessa's name from their board. By evening, one of the 2 investors she had mentioned in our last confrontation sent a letter to my attorney, requesting formal withdrawal from all discussions regarding vineyard development. The silence coming from her side was telling. For the first time since Lydia passed, the pressure shifted. It wasn't just mine to carry anymore. The community had seen. They had heard. And whether they supported me out of respect, guilt, or clarity, it no longer mattered. The line had been drawn. Eleanor came by the next day with a folder in her hand and a set to her jaw that I recognized from her courtroom days. She sat down at the table and opened the folder. I need you to see this, she said. It was a copy of a contract Vanessa had drafted, but never filed. A sale agreement. Vanessa had intended to hand over 3 parcels of Lydia's land to a developer under a silent deal contingent on her contesting the will and obtaining temporary control. She would not have succeeded, but she had tried, and it was in writing. The deal had fallen apart the moment Clara's footage aired, but the document remained. It was enough. Eleanor met my eyes. I've already submitted it to the local land commission. If she tries again through another name, they'll flag it. I closed the folder, a weary relief washing over me. It was all beginning to settle. I should have felt complete relief, but there was still one part left. Vanessa hadn't left town. She hadn't apologized. She hadn't responded to the footage, the meeting, the backlash. She had gone quiet, and that, more than anything, meant she was planning something. That evening, I walked through the vineyard with Maya. She hadn't said much after the meeting, but I could tell something had shifted in her, too. We walked past the oldest section where Lydia's favorite rows still produced small, sweet fruit that reminded us both of summers long gone. Maya paused and looked at me. I've never seen a room turn like that before. You didn't raise your voice. You just told the truth. I nodded. Lydia used to say a lie makes noise. Truth does not need to. Maya smiled and walked ahead, but I stayed back. There was something I needed to do before the sunset. I returned to the house and opened Lydia's safe again. There was one letter I had not touched yet. It was addressed to the foundation board, dated 3 weeks before her death. In it, she stated clearly that under no circumstances was Vanessa to be included in any decision-making capacity related to the land, the foundation, or the business operations. She had written it as a precaution. Now it would become a final, unassailable tool. Maxwell reviewed it that evening and nodded once. This makes it airtight. She has no path forward now, not legally, not reputationally. The next morning, I drove into town for errands. People looked at me differently, not with pity or curiosity anymore, but with something else, recognition. The woman behind the counter at the feed store handed me my receipt and said quietly, "You did good." It wasn't praise. It was permission to stand tall, to keep going. When I returned home, I found Vanessa's car parked in front of the main house. She was sitting on the porch swing, arms folded, eyes hard. She didn't rise when I stepped out. I stood at the bottom of the steps. She stared at me like she was calculating again, but this time, the math was failing her. "You humiliated me," she accused, her voice flat. I didn't respond. She stood. "You made me look like a monster." Still, I said nothing. "You think this is over?" I held her gaze. She blinked first. I could see it. The crack. She wanted to scream, but there was nothing left to scream about. She had tried everything: pity, intimidation, manipulation, public shaming, legal threats, online defamation. None of it worked. Not because I was stronger, but because she underestimated what it meant to carry history, to have roots that ran deep. She stepped off the porch and walked past me. As she reached her car, she turned once more, her voice barely a whisper. "You've ruined everything." Then she got in and drove away. I stood there a while, not triumphant, not bitter, just still. Inside the house, I sat at Lydia's desk and wrote a letter. It was short. It thanked the foundation board for their trust. It confirmed my intention to honor Lydia's legacy. It enclosed a copy of her final letter and stated that I would be moving forward with her vision in full. When I finished, I signed my name and slid the page into an envelope. I placed it on the table. Then I went outside and stood in the sun. The air smelled like soil and grapes and dust. It was the scent of something saved, something earned, and I had not forgotten what was next. Vanessa had been stripped of her masks. Now it was time to face the legal consequences of what she tried to do. But that would begin tomorrow. Tonight, I would rest and listen to the vineyard breathing. Because the land, unlike people, never lies. It simply waits to be protected. It began with an envelope from the county office, hand-delivered by a clerk with kind eyes and a clipboard. She didn't stay long, just handed it to me, asked me to sign, and gave a short nod before returning to her vehicle. The envelope contained a formal notice of investigation. The county had launched an internal audit after receiving a report from an anonymous source. The contents of the report included documents Eleanor had flagged, combined with footage from Clara's piece. It didn't mention Vanessa's name directly, but the timeline, email headers, and contract references made it unmistakably clear they were coming for her. I sat at Lydia's desk again, this time feeling no heat in my chest, no tightness in my jaw. I had done what needed to be done. Now the weight had shifted to the legal system. I called Maxwell. He wasn't surprised. "They'll ask for your cooperation," he said, "not just as the inheritor, but as a witness to the intent." I told him I was ready. He told me to get everything organized. That afternoon, I gathered all the original files, emails, copies of the draft contract, Lydia's final voice recording, the letter to the foundation board. Everything was sorted into folders labeled with sticky notes and clipped in sets of 3. By the time Eleanor arrived, the table looked like a courtroom exhibit. She reviewed everything in silence. When she was finished, she leaned back, sighed, and said one word: solid. Then she picked up her pen and added a few annotations of her own. Meanwhile, word had spread. It wasn't just the vineyard community anymore. People from nearby towns started calling the office, asking if it was true, whether Lydia's land had been at risk, whether Vanessa had really tried to sell to developers from out of state. Clara's news piece, once a local scandal, had gone regional, then national. It hit the right vein: family betrayal, old land, money, inheritance, the classic American powder keg. By the third day, a second envelope arrived. This one from the district attorney's office. It stated that an initial hearing had been set to determine whether formal charges could be filed against Vanessa for fraud, attempted misappropriation of trust assets, and willful misrepresentation of her legal standing. It was real now, not symbolic, not public shaming. Real. The same afternoon, Vanessa's car disappeared from the driveway of the rental she'd been staying in. The lights were off, the curtains drawn. No one had seen her leave. I knew she hadn't gone far. Vanessa never ran. She hid, then struck when she thought everyone had exhaled. But this time, the window was closed. Maxwell called me in for a deposition. I wore the same simple outfit I had worn at the town hall, jeans, a white shirt, Lydia's vineyard hat. I brought the folders, handed them off, and sat across from the legal aid without fuss. My voice didn't shake. I told the truth. From the moment Vanessa arrived at the funeral to the email about the bulldozers, from Lydia's words to her last wishes, from the whispers in town to the meeting that flipped everything. The legal aid asked about my relationship with Vanessa. I didn't soften the answer. We were estranged for years. She reached out to me only after Lydia passed. She had not spoken to me during Lydia's illness. She reappeared only when Lydia's estate was announced. I kept my voice low, steady. I didn't color the facts. I didn't need to. The truth carried its own weight. After the deposition, I walked down the courthouse steps and paused at the base. The air felt strange, light. I didn't feel victorious. I felt precise, like a thread had finally been pulled through the last button. That evening, Samuel stopped by with news. One of Vanessa's old associates had given a statement. An investor she tried to recruit in secret. He had brought emails, text records, voice notes, everything she thought was buried. He had turned them over to the DA. Because of that, a second hearing was now scheduled. Potential charges now included coercion, falsifying investor documents, and ethical violations tied to misrepresentation of her stake in Lydia's trust. The news spread fast. Vanessa's name was no longer being whispered in resentment. It was being spoken aloud in courtrooms. I heard from Maya later that associations connected to Lydia's work had gathered more than 4,000 signatures in 24 hours. Even people who had never visited the vineyard before were speaking up. They saw themselves in the story. They saw what betrayal looked like when it dressed up in designer clothes and smiled for the cameras. I stayed out of the comment sections. I didn't need the noise. I had work to do. By the end of the week, people started showing up to help with this year's harvest. People I hadn't seen in years. Friends of Lydia, former students, even a few local kids from the high school agricultural program. They didn't come for headlines. They came because they knew this land deserved to survive beyond the scandal. I worked beside them. I didn't speak about Vanessa. Not anymore. Let the courts handle what I had already exposed. That night, I received one final letter. It came from Vanessa's lawyer. A quiet withdrawal of all claims. No apology, no explanation, just 2 pages of cold legal language stating that she would not pursue any rights or privileges under Lydia's estate. I read it 3 times. Then I placed it beside Lydia's last letter. The contrast said more than any courtroom could. I went to bed early that night, not because I was tired, but because for the first time in months, my sleep would not be interrupted by doubt. And outside, the vineyard stood quiet, still mine, still untouched, still enough. It was just past 6 in the evening when I saw the old white sedan roll into the gravel lot. I had been pruning the edge vines near the south fence, my gloves damp with sap and dirt. The light was turning golden, that quiet stretch before dusk when the vines looked like rows of lit candles. I heard the car door close, not slammed, but not gentle either. She stood at the edge of the field like she didn't quite know how to move forward. Her hair was pinned up too tightly. Her face looked drawn, the cheekbones sharper than I remembered. The suit she wore had clearly been pressed that morning, but the shoulders hung stiff, like she'd worn it all day with the weight of something heavy in the pockets. Vanessa didn't speak first. She just waited. I peeled off my gloves, tucked them into my back pocket, and stepped through the rows until I was standing 10 feet from her. The silence between us wasn't fragile. It was dense. She looked me in the eye, so I nodded once, a signal, not of welcome, not of forgiveness, just recognition. She followed me to the back porch. I didn't invite her inside. We sat outside, 2 chairs facing west toward the hills. The air smelled like lavender and dust. I poured us each a glass of water and waited. Vanessa finally spoke. She said she had seen the letter, the official withdrawal. I said I had too. She said she wasn't there to ask for anything. No appeals, no claims, no dramatic last requests. I nodded again. Then she sat quietly for a moment, fingers wrapped tightly around the glass, and said she never planned on it getting this far. I didn't respond. She said she just wanted a piece of something, a part of Lydia, a part of legacy that she thought she deserved, at least that much. I looked at her, calm, even. I told her legacy isn't given because you show up after the soil's been tilled and claim you had a seed in the ground. She turned her face away, but I didn't soften. I told her she didn't come to the hospital when Lydia was ill, didn't call once. Didn't send flowers or a card, not even a 2-line message. I reminded her that Lydia left the ranch to me, not because I asked, but because I stayed. Because I watered vines through drought, mended fences in winter, and held her hand when her mind started slipping and she forgot which day it was. Vanessa clenched her jaw, but she didn't interrupt. I said Lydia knew who had roots here, and she made her choice with clarity. She asked then what I wanted from her. It wasn't a question, not really, more like an admission, a laying down of the last weapon. I told her I didn't want anything. I didn't need her apology. I didn't need her to confess or to cry or to prove she was sorry. What I needed was silence. What I needed was distance. What I needed was for the story to end. Vanessa sat very still. I reminded her that what she did wasn't just betrayal. It was theft, attempted erasure, and public humiliation. I reminded her that she stood in a church and called her mother a parasite. I told her she wasn't a victim of a mistake. She was the architect of it. The sun dipped lower, casting shadows across her hands. Her fingers tightened around the glass. She said she had nothing now. No house, no friends left. Her husband was gone. Her job suspended, her name stained. She said she was hollowed out. I said that sometimes being emptied is the first step to becoming someone new. She let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, more like breath catching on old wounds. Then she asked, "Why not fight harder to save us?" I turned my eyes toward the vineyard, watching the golden light fade. "Because you lit the fire," I said, and I was done running into burning buildings for people who locked the door from the inside. Vanessa didn't argue. She sat there quietly. Her shoulders slumped now, the sharpness gone. Just a woman with nothing left but whatever came next. I stood up. She didn't. I said one last thing before I went back inside. "You're still my daughter. That won't change. But love without respect is just a wound we keep pressing on." I walked away. I didn't turn around. Inside, I stood at the window and watched her sit alone for a few more minutes. Then she stood, walked slowly to her car and drove off. No goodbyes, no drama, just an ending. That night, I didn't write anything down. I didn't relive it. I didn't tell Samuel or Eleanor or Clara. Some things don't need repeating. They need closing. I closed the door. I poured myself tea. I sat in the quiet of the old cottage and watched the last rays of light fall over the land Lydia left in my hands. And I let them fall. The morning after Vanessa left, the ranch felt unusually still. Not silent, but settled. The kind of quiet that comes after something heavy has been removed. I woke up before sunrise, as I always did. But this time, I sat on the edge of the bed for a few extra minutes. My hands rested on my knees, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the usual weight pressing on my chest. I didn't make coffee right away. I let the wind bring in whatever it wanted. The smell of damp earth, the faint perfume of crushed lavender, the rustle of birds waiting in the vines. Everything felt lighter, even the dust. I didn't feel victorious. That wasn't the right word. There had been no celebration, no slamming of doors, no applause. What I felt was closer to clean, like I had taken a deep breath after years of holding it, like I had stepped out of something dark and into air. I ate breakfast on the back porch, just toast and eggs. I didn't want much. The wind had picked up a little, and the leaves danced across the wooden deck in swirls. The old dog, Clovis, came and rested his chin on my knee. I scratched behind his ear. Neither of us needed to speak. I knew the days ahead would not be simple. The wound between Vanessa and me hadn't disappeared. It had simply been cauterized. It would scar, but it would no longer fester. That was enough for now. I spent the morning walking the property. It was something Lydia used to do. She called it touching base with the land. I followed her old paths, down by the orchard, through the low fields, past the shed where we used to store rainwater. I let my fingers brush over the wild herbs that had crept up along the fences. I stood at the edge of the vineyard and watched the rows of vines, some thick and ancient, some newly planted just a year ago. I thought about how long it had taken for them to grow, to take root, to bear fruit. There was something deeply honest about their process. They didn't rush. They didn't complain. They simply did what they were made to do, season after season. I walked past the barn and into the cattle pens. The calves were restless that morning. A few of them kicked up dirt and snorted at each other. I tossed some hay into their trough and leaned on the gate for a while. I watched them settle the way they always did. It reminded me that life continues, no matter how dramatic the day before might have been. Around noon, I went back inside and opened the big ledger in the kitchen. Lydia's handwriting filled the first half. My own filled the second. There were still bills to pay, accounts to balance, deliveries to confirm. The life of the land didn't pause for personal battles. It demanded attention, and I gave it. But between the numbers, I paused to think, not about Vanessa, not even about what had happened. I thought about what would come next. The ranch had always belonged to Lydia, and now it belonged to me. But soon it would need to belong to someone else, not just legally, but in spirit. Someone who would love it the way we did, not out of obligation, but out of reverence. I made a call to Eleanor that afternoon. She answered on the second ring, her voice steady as ever, bringing a kind of calm I hadn't realized I needed. I asked if she could come by next week, just to talk. She said she'd bring tea and ginger scones. Later that evening, I pulled out the wooden box from the top shelf of my closet. Inside were old photographs, notes Lydia had written me over the years, and a few pieces of jewelry I hadn't worn in decades. I sifted through them slowly, holding each one like a fragment of something I hadn't finished understanding. One photograph stopped me. It was Lydia and me, leaning against the porch railing, wine glasses in hand, both of us mid-laughter. I must have been in my late 40s. She had just turned 60. I remembered that day. The sun had been relentless. We were covered in dust, hair pulled back, boots muddy, but we laughed like we had discovered something ancient and joyful. That photo reminded me of who we were before the bruises and the bitterness. Before Vanessa and the silence and the accusations, it reminded me that joy had lived here once, unshaken, wild, and free. That night, I lit a candle in the kitchen, not for ritual, just for light. I left the windows open, let the wind move through the house. I wrote in my notebook, something I hadn't done in months. I wrote about the weight of silence, the sharpness of memory, the ache of motherhood. I wrote that forgiveness is not the same as forgetting, that it does not come wrapped in warmth or tied with ribbons. It arrives slowly, dragging its feet, asking nothing except that we be willing to stop feeding the fire. I didn't write Vanessa's name. I didn't need to. Some things are better left between the lines. By the time I went to bed, the candle had nearly burned itself out. The house smelled of cedar and smoke. I closed the windows gently, locked the back door, and checked on Clovis. He was already asleep, curled near the fireplace. I turned off the lights, climbed under the quilt, and lay there listening to the wind outside. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something begin to settle deep inside my bones. It wasn't happiness, not yet. But it was peace. The sun rose behind a soft veil of clouds that morning, casting the vineyard in a silver light. I stepped outside with a mug of black coffee, wrapped in my old flannel shawl. There was no wind, just a stillness that felt like the world was holding its breath. The air tasted like change. I had spent the past few days thinking, walking, and listening. Lydia's absence no longer felt like a wound. It had become a space. And in that space, I realized what needed to happen. This land was no longer just a memory of her. It was my responsibility, my voice, my way of choosing what legacy looked like now that all the old scripts had burned away. So I dressed, not in denim or mud boots, but in slacks and a crisp blouse. I drove to town, the tires humming against the road, steady and grounding. I didn't listen to music. I didn't need distractions. My first stop was the attorney's office. Eleanor met me at the entrance, her smile kind but unreadable. She led me into the same conference room where months ago I had been handed Lydia's will, trembling like a child. This time, I was the one holding papers. I handed her a folder. Inside were instructions, new ones. I told her I wanted to restructure the estate. I would be keeping ownership of the house, the vineyard, and the cattle until I passed. But I wanted to create something bigger than a simple inheritance. I wanted a trust, a community endowment in Lydia's name, one that would offer grants, mentorship, and legal support for women over 50 restarting their lives after loss or betrayal. Eleanor leaned back reading. I watched her eyes move across the page, calm and careful. She said very little at first, just a few clarifying comments. I told her I didn't want it to be flashy or overly charitable in appearance. This wasn't about publicity. It was about control, about clarity, about rewriting the rules of what it meant to protect someone you loved, even after they were gone. Then I added a clause. Vanessa would receive nothing, not because I was angry, but because I was finally done negotiating my worth. When Eleanor nodded and promised to begin drafting the documents, I thanked her. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I simply picked up my shawl, folded it over my arm, and left. Next, I visited the vineyard office. I called a staff meeting, a small team, just 7 people. Some had worked with Lydia for over 2 decades. Others were newer, still finding their rhythm. They looked at me with a mix of expectation and fatigue. I told them the ranch would continue as it always had. No one was losing their job, no abrupt changes. But I would be introducing a new line of business, a community initiative offering weekend training programs on sustainable agriculture and wine production for women over 50 looking to rebuild careers. Some faces lit up, others looked confused. I laid out outlines, left space for questions they didn't voice, and ended the meeting. After that, I returned home. I moved through the house with purpose. I started with the guest bedroom, took out the floral bedding Vanessa had once chosen when she used to visit, packed it in a box, replaced it with Lydia's quilt. I changed out the frames in the hallway, removed the wedding photo of Vanessa and Todd, put up pictures of harvest days, Lydia beaming behind rows of grape crates. I walked into my office, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out the old tin box, the one filled with letters from Vanessa. I reread a few, some full of affection, some filled with bitterness. Then I put them all in a manila envelope, sealed it, and wrote her name across the front. I didn't throw it away. I placed it on the top shelf of the closet, out of reach, but not erased. The next day, I began making calls, one to Alma Vasquez, a woman I had met once through Lydia, widowed at 58, left with debt, a collapsed roof, and no pension. Alma had since built a tiny jam business that now sold at local farmers markets across 3 counties. I invited her for lunch. Another call to Jeanette Waller, a former high school teacher who had been ousted quietly after a divorce scandal. She had experience in adult education. I asked if she'd be interested in designing workshops for the ranch's training weekends. By the end of the week, I had 6 women lined up for the first evening. I sat on the front porch with a glass of Lydia's Merlot. The sky burned gold behind the hills. I watched the vines bend slightly in the wind, whispering among themselves like women trading secrets after a long day. I wasn't trying to build an empire. I was simply trying to anchor myself in something that felt honest. Then, just as the sun began to dip behind the ridge, a car pulled up. It was Todd. He stepped out in pressed slacks and a navy shirt. No tie. He walked like a man who still believed charm could solve anything. I stayed seated. He didn't ask to come in. He just stood there, hands in his pockets. He said Vanessa wanted another conversation. He said she regretted how things went. He said the money wasn't the issue, that she felt hurt, abandoned. I didn't move. I didn't offer a chair. I told him Vanessa had chosen her silence. She had thrown her line in the sand long before Lydia died. I wasn't about to drag myself over broken glass to reach a hand that only ever pointed blame. I told him the estate had been restructured. He flinched. Then he smiled, said he understood. I let him leave with that smile. It was the last thing I owed him. That night, I wrote again, not about Vanessa, but about Lydia, about what it means to protect something after it's gone, about how sometimes the greatest power is not revenge, but reinvention. And for the first time, the page didn't shake under my hand. It held firm like the land, like the bones beneath it. It began with whispers, just a few murmurs at first. A woman from the next county over stopped me at the farmer's market, said she had seen a flyer about the vineyard workshops, said she had always wanted to learn how to graft vines, but thought she was too old. Then another woman, this one younger, told me she'd heard about Lydia Monroe's ranch being used for some kind of secret training camp. I smiled, kept walking, but inside I felt the current shifting. The seed had grown faster than I imagined. But it was the phone call from Jeanette that told me everything was about to change. She said a woman named Trisha Barnes had shown up to the info session. Said she was referred by someone named Vanessa. Said Vanessa was now calling herself a consultant. Said she was taking credit for the entire program. I remember sitting very still as Jeanette told me that. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't say Vanessa's name aloud. I only asked Jeanette to forward me the materials, the flyers, the emails, and there it was, my daughter's name stamped across the bottom of a glossy trifold brochure, Vanessa Monroe, Strategic Community Development Advisor. She had rewritten herself into the story again, but this time she wasn't trying to rewrite me. She was trying to stand in front of the thing I had built. I didn't call her. Instead, I met with Eleanor. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't even raise an eyebrow. She simply listened, took notes, pulled out a thick folder I hadn't seen before. Inside were records, copies of the flyers, email threads from participants, social media screenshots, proof that Vanessa had misrepresented herself as a co-founder of the Monroe Women's Trust, that she had taken funds from at least 4 attendees for early access mentorship sessions. Eleanor said just one word, fraud. Then she asked what I wanted to do, and I told her. 2 days later, Eleanor sent a cease and desist letter to Vanessa's attorney. 2 days after that, we filed a formal complaint with the state. The workshop funds were frozen. A temporary injunction was placed on Vanessa's consulting activities using our name. And just like that, the mirror cracked. I heard about it first from Todd. He showed up again, this time looking nothing like his polished self. Eyes bloodshot, tie gone, shirt wrinkled. He didn't ask to come inside. Just stood there on the porch and mumbled that things had gotten complicated, said Vanessa was spiraling. Said she was blaming me for everything. I told him to leave again, but before he turned away, I said one last thing, tell her I'm done protecting her from the truth. He didn't answer. Just turned and walked back to the car, slower than before. Within the week, word spread. Local business owners who had supported the workshops began distancing themselves from Vanessa. A small expose ran in the regional paper detailing how she had leveraged the Monroe name for personal gain. Jeanette told me a few women withdrew from future sessions, afraid of being associated with scandal. I could have been angry, but I wasn't. I was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, the kind that comes from holding too many stories that never got told. So, I told mine. With Eleanor's help, we published a short open letter. It was printed in the Sunday paper. No drama, no accusations, just the truth. I shared how the ranch came into my hands, how Lydia had left it to me, not just as property, but as a reminder of who I used to be. I talked about what the trust was meant to do. I explained how it would continue with or without the approval of those who once shared my blood. The following Sunday, I held the first harvest day for the community. 32 women showed up. We walked the rows together, laughed, pulled grapes with sticky fingers, ate sandwiches under the oaks. Some cried, most smiled. That night, I sat in the same porch chair as always, watching the horizon. The sky was heavy with stars. The air smelled like ripe earth and wine. Then I heard footsteps. Not the nervous shuffle of Todd, not the careful click of Eleanor's heels, but a slow, steady walk. I knew it before I turned my head. Vanessa. She stood at the base of the steps, pale, hair pulled back, not in silk or pearls, but in jeans and a wrinkled t-shirt. She didn't speak at first. I didn't ask her to. She finally said she hadn't expected things to go that far, that she only wanted to feel useful again, that she didn't know how to ask me for help without making it about herself. I listened. Then I told her this wasn't about usefulness or forgiveness. It was about boundaries. I told her I wished her healing, but not in my house, not on my land, not in my name. She nodded once, eyes wet, but she didn't beg, didn't plead. She turned and walked away. And for the first time in years, I didn't watch her leave with a broken heart. I watched her leave with peace. That night, I opened Lydia's old journal. I wrote one final line beneath her last entry. We come from the earth. We return to it, but in between, we must learn to root ourselves in truth. And I slept without dreams. The vines were coming back to life again after months of repair, replanting, and cautious tending. The vineyard looked less like a wound and more like a body healing. The branches stretched toward the light with a kind of quiet confidence. Some mornings I stood on the back patio with my coffee and just watched the fog rise over the fields. The peace was almost unsettling, but I welcomed it. There was no ceremony when I stepped fully into the role of running the trust. It wasn't marked by any headline or plaque. It was the kind of transition that happened in quiet gestures. A woman in her 60s dropping off a letter asking to volunteer. A high school girl asking if we accepted applications for mentorship. A retired professor emailing with interest in teaching workshops about self-reliance and land stewardship. It all came in slowly, gently, like rain you didn't notice until the ground softened beneath your feet. Jeanette became my right hand without either of us saying so. She stopped calling me Miss Monroe, just you and we now. We redesigned the course offerings, added a monthly open circle for women to share their stories, removed long intake forms, replaced them with conversation. One Tuesday afternoon, Jeanette brought me a wrapped box. Inside was a simple wooden sign, carved with the name we'd spoken aloud only once before, the Lydia Monroe Women's Circle. I didn't cry, but I felt something loosen in my chest. A tension I hadn't known I was still carrying. We mounted the sign by the barn entrance. No announcement, no ribbon, just there, waiting. By late April, the ranch was no longer just mine. It had taken on a rhythm again. People showed up on Saturdays with pie or jam or folding chairs. They left with cuttings, advice, or sometimes just a warm hand on their shoulder. No one asked who owned what. No one asked about Vanessa. I stopped offering answers. The Cadillac sat under the carport, still in mint condition. Some days I thought about selling it. Other days I imagined restoring it fully, repainting it in Lydia's favorite shade of hunter green. But most of the time I just left it there, a relic, a reminder. Eleanor still visited, though less frequently. She had taken on more pro bono work after everything went public. Said helping women reclaim their assets had become more than a legal cause. Said it was personal now. One afternoon as we walked the perimeter together, she looked over the vineyard rows and said she hadn't expected things to settle so fast. I told her it wasn't about speed. It was about choosing stillness over chaos. Letting the noise burn itself out while you keep planting. She nodded, and we walked in silence for a while. Around the same time, an old friend from Lydia's past reached out. Miriam, a woman who had once co-managed a small winery with her. She sent a letter saying she had been following the news, said she had a parcel of land in Mendocino that she no longer needed. Asked if I would take a look, said she'd rather pass it on to someone with calloused hands than another faceless development company. I took the train up. Miriam was in her 80s now, sharp eyes, no-nonsense voice. But when she showed me the rows of dormant vines, the broken fence, the creek winding along the edge, I saw the ghost of Lydia standing beside her. We didn't shake hands. She just handed me a folder with the deed and said, make something honest out of it. By the end of that month, the trust had its first satellite site. Smaller, harsher soil, but real possibilities. News didn't travel far, but in our corner of the world, it was enough. A few women from the original group volunteered to help restore it. Jeanette coordinated the early logistics. I drove back and forth twice a week, wearing gloves that Lydia once used. I didn't talk much during those drives, just breathed. In those moments, I didn't feel like someone who had been betrayed or left or erased. I felt like someone who had planted herself again. Evenings on the main ranch grew quieter. The volunteers would leave. Jeanette would head home. The dogs would curl at the foot of the porch. I would sit with a blanket around my shoulders, watch the last streak of light fade beyond the hills. And sometimes I would write, not in Lydia's journal, but in a new one. I didn't document the drama or the fights or the hearings. I wrote about soil types, root growth, the different shapes women's faces took when they smiled with both grief and relief. I wrote about the way light changed in the afternoon when no one was watching. I wrote about starting over, not as a grand gesture, but as 1,000 small choices made alone. It wasn't forgiveness, it was presence, the kind that doesn't ask to be seen, just felt. And so the ranch became quieter. And I became louder in other ways. Not through shouting, but through ownership, through clarity, through a silence that was no longer empty, but full. By the end of the season, I had started planning something new. Not a class, not a workshop, a legacy. But that's for another chapter. Summer rolled in, quiet and warm. The vineyard hummed softly in the heat. Bees drifted lazily around the lavender that lined the back porch. For the first time in years, I felt no pull to prove anything. Not to Vanessa, not to Lydia's memory, not even to myself. I had already done it. The trust was no longer just a legal structure. It had grown into something living. Every week, women arrived at the ranch with different stories, different ages, and different wounds. They worked the land not just to harvest grapes or till soil, but to reclaim their sense of value. I watched it happen in small gestures. A woman who hadn't spoken above a whisper, laughing by the barn. A grandmother teaching a younger woman how to check the health of a rootstock. These moments told me more than any article or financial report ever could. There was no announcement the day the final deed was signed. I walked into the local registrar's office in town, sat across from a clerk who looked barely old enough to drink, and signed over the Mendocino property to the trust under its full name, the Lydia Monroe Foundation for Women Reclaiming Their Lives. No red tape, no cameras, just ink and silence. I didn't tell Vanessa. I didn't need to. She had disappeared from the news cycle. Her name had stopped appearing in search alerts. Whatever money she thought she would gain from tearing me down had evaporated the moment I refused to let her hold the narrative. And that was enough for me. I had no interest in her apology. I didn't crave reconciliation. I had made peace with silence. It was a different silence than before, not the kind born from being ignored or dismissed. This was the kind I chose, a silence that grew from clarity, ownership, purpose. Some evenings I would drive the Cadillac along the back roads. I didn't play the radio. I let the windows down and just listened. The sound of the wind brushing the fields, the rubber humming against the pavement, my own breath. That was enough. There was a Sunday mid-August when Jeanette brought her daughter to the ranch. She was 8. Her name was Nova, bright-eyed, wild hair, wore boots that were clearly too big for her. Nova ran up to me with a purple notebook in hand and asked if she could plant her own vine. I nodded, didn't say a word. We walked out past the barn, down to the southeast corner of the vineyard where the soil was richest. Nova kneeled and pressed her hands into the dirt like it was a secret. She dug a small hole, placed her seedling gently, and whispered something I couldn't hear. When she looked up, she smiled with all her teeth. That night, I wrote in my journal, not about betrayal, not about court battles or titles. I wrote, today, a little girl named Nova planted her future beside mine, and it was enough. In the days that followed, we prepared for the first annual gathering of the Circle. Women from across the region came together on the ranch. Some brought their daughters, others came alone. We had music, simple food, stories by the fire. When it was my turn to speak, I stood in front of them, looking out at the vineyard, bathed in amber light, and said one sentence. This land was once a battlefield. Now it's a table, and there's room for every one of you. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. They understood. By the end of the night, the barn was filled with laughter. Not the kind that covers pain, the kind that rises from it. I didn't see Vanessa again. Not at the ranch. Not on the news. I don't know if she ever healed. I don't know if she ever looked back and saw the damage she left behind. But I stopped needing answers. I stopped needing anything from someone who had once chosen to leave. This life I rebuilt was not an act of revenge. It was an act of refusal. I refused to carry her hatred. I refused to inherit her silence. I refused to let her define my last chapter. And now I'm writing my own. So, if you ever find yourself abandoned, forgotten, discarded by the very people who once called you family, remember this. Silence can be survival, but rebuilding is power. And I rebuilt, not to prove a point, but to plant a future.